So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 8th talk in the World of Jane Austen series. And the final talk will be tomorrow night on letters in Jane Austen's time with Robert Morrison, who has spoken here many times, and he is an expert on the Regency period. She has she's known to most of you, I think, because she has spoken here several times. And she has a background in graphic design from the London College of Printing. She started a career in publishing as a designer and illustrator for Studio Vista, then Cassell and Collier's and Macmillan. In her 50s, after her children left home, she changed directions and read English and cultural studies at the University of Warwick. She's a published writer, a family historian, and since moving to Bath 23 years ago, she's given talks at Oxford University, the National Trust, the British Commonwealth Society, U3A, and of course, this institution, where for many years she served as a director and chair of programs. She's spoken on numerous subjects such as faith and gender, birth of feminism, the flight of the Huguenots, Rosa Luxemburg, Sir Robert Dudley, Charles Darwin, Mary Wollstonecraft. Yes, the list goes on. And tonight, she's going to be speaking about whether or not Fanny Burney is Jane Austen's favorite author. Let's see. Can we welcome Marie-Louise?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes? Because I'm very short, you know. Right, let's start. The only known image, authentic image of Jane Austen is this rather unflattering portrait drawn by her sister Cassandra. It was embellished in the 19th century after her death and altered still further when it appeared on the £10 banknote in 2014. Underneath her image on the banknote is this quotation: "I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading." The quotation from Pride and Prejudice continues: "How much sooner one tires of anything than a book. When I have a house of my own, I shall be miserable if I have not an excellent library." Jane Austen never had that house of her own with its excellent library, but in Steventon Parsonage, when she was growing up, she had access to her father's library of 500 volumes and became a subscriber to Mrs. Martin's library. When the family left Steventon from Bath after the Reverend George Austen retired, he sold his books. But in Bath, Jane took advantage of the circulating libraries, where members paid a seasonal fee to borrow books. She received books as gifts, read books shared among the family, and took advantage of her brother Edward's magnificent library on the estate he inherited, Godmersham Park. Godmersham Park appears in the background of this banknote. Jane Austen visited Godmersham over a 15-year period, from 1798 to 1813. Staying there for a total of 10 months, she devoured the classical tomes one might expect to find in a gentleman's library, the up-to-date scientific and philosophical outpourings of the Enlightenment, conduct manuals, poetry volumes, chronicles, gazettes, periodicals, and novels. Jane Austen was an avid reader of everything, as her posthumous novel, Northanger Abbey, a light-hearted satire on reading and misreading, reveals. There are references to Dr. Johnson, David Hume, William Robertson, Oliver Goldsmith, Milton, Pope. The list goes on and includes an extensive number of novelists such as Henry Fielding, Lawrence Sterne, and Samuel Richardson. Incidentally, these male novelists from an earlier era had all died before Austen was born. Samuel Richardson, her brother claimed, was Jane Austen's favorite writer. Indeed, as a teenager, Jane condensed Richardson's whopping 6-novel epistolary novel, Sir Charles Grandison, into a short dramatic lampoon for the amusement of her family. According to her nephew James Austen Leigh, her knowledge of Samuel Richardson was such as no one is likely again to acquire. Every circumstance narrated in Sir Charles Grandison was familiar to her, and the characters well remembered as if they were living friends. The Austens were a well-read literary family. They would read books together, and as an adult, Jane became known for reading aloud remarkably well. They reread favorite novels, discussed the characters, and constantly made references to them in their letters, treating them as familiar friends that needed no introduction. The Austens are great novelists and not ashamed of being so, Jane remarked in a letter to Cassandra. The narrator of Northanger Abbey reiterates this point. Yes, novels, for I will not adopt that ungenerous and impolitic custom so common with novel writers of degrading by their contemptuous censure the very performance to the number of which they are adding. Let us leave it to the reviewers to abuse such effusions of fancy at their leisure, for there seems almost a general wish to decry the capacity and undervaluing the labor of the novelist, and of slighting the performances which have only genius, wit, and taste to recommend them. And what are you reading, miss? Oh, it's only a novel, replies the young lady as she lays down her book with affected indifference or momentary shame. It's only Cecilia or Camilla or Belinda, the work of the greatest power of the mind, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, the liveliest effusions of wit and humor are conveyed to the world in the best chosen language. Of these 3 novels mentioned in Northanger Abbey, Cecilia and Camilla were written by Frances Burney, and Belinda by Maria Edgeworth. Northanger Abbey, which originated 18 years earlier under the unassuming title Susan, was written during the height of Fanny Burney's fame. She was the celebrated author of 3 novels, Evelina, 1778, Cecilia, 1782, and Camilla, 1796. Camilla was reprinted in 1802 when Jane was revising Susan. Anne Radcliffe was author of the highly popular Gothic novel The Mysteries of Udolpho, which Austen gleefully satirizes in Northanger Abbey. And it is thought Austen added Maria Edgeworth's Belinda, which had recently been published, just before the manuscript was sold for £10 to the publisher in 1803. These female novelists, Frances Burney, Maria Edgeworth, and Anne Radcliffe, were contemporaries, all successful living female novelists, born before Jane Austen, but who would all outlive her. Jane Austen's letters are strewn with references to characters met in novels. Here are 3 examples of characters from Burney's novels that Jane mentions in letters to Cassandra. From Camilla, tomorrow I shall be like Camilla in Mr. Dubster's summer house. From Evelina, what a contretemps in the language of France, what an unluckiness in that of Madame Duval. Madame Duval was Evelina's excruciating French grandmother in the novel. From Cecilia, take care of your precious self, do not work too hard. Remember that Aunt Cassandra's are quite as scarce as Miss Beverley's. In Cecilia, Miss Beverley is introduced as the only survivor of the Beverley family. Frances, or Fanny Burney, was born 22 years before Jane Austen and would outlive her by another 22 years. Although contemporaries, their lives were very different. Jane Austen's first 25 years were spent at her father's parsonage, Steventon, in rural Hampshire, in a world that consisted, in her words, of 3 or 4 families living in a country village. And it was from this close domestic world that Jane would draw her inspiration. During her short life, she would visit London, Bath, Southampton, Lyme Regis, and her brother Edward's home of Rowling in Kent and his estates of Godmersham, Kent, and Chawton in Hampshire, where she spent the last 8 years of her life with her mother and sister in a cottage on the Chawton estate. Jane Austen wrote no diary, and we only glimpse her private life from letters that survive to friends and family members. These letters are gossipy and full of in-jokes, never intended for publication. They were just an important means of keeping in touch with family and friends, equivalent to sending text messages today. E.M. Forster, reviewing the publication of Jane Austen's letters to her sister Cassandra and others in 1932, remarked cuttingly, "She takes no account of politics or religion, and none of the war, except when it brings prize money to her brothers." Jane's niece, Caroline, revealed that her Aunt Cassandra took it upon herself to destroy a large bulk of Jane's letters. So sadly, we have no idea what tantalizing secrets they might have revealed. Fanny Burney also wrote about her world, but what a different world. She was acquainted with many of the great charismatic men and women of the day, and by extraordinary chance witnessed many of the important events that unfolded around her. She was at court when an attempt was made on the king's life. She met Napoleon in Paris, but also saw Wellington reviewing his troops at Waterloo. All this she recorded in her diaries and letter journals. As well as being a shrewd chronicler of her times, Burney left behind numerous plays and 4 substantial novels, and in her lifetime enjoyed great literary esteem, which Jane Austen was only beginning to enjoy at the end of her short life. 22 years older, Fanny Burney's world was distinctly Georgian, while Jane Austen inhabited the more refined Regency period. And you can see the difference 22 years make when you examine the fashions of the periods. When Burney published Evelina, Cecilia, and Camilla, her characters would have dressed like this on the left. The clothes are highly embellished. Yes, on the left. Are highly embellished. Hair is elaborate, powdered, and false. The lady wears a silk gown, tight corset, and an enormous hat, like the clothes Burney wears in her portrait. 22 years later, fashions have changed dramatically. The gentlemen have discarded frills and wig. His hair is natural and cut short. His clothes are unembellished and practical. The lady too is simply dressed. Her hair is natural, her hat unadorned, and her dress of plain cotton muslin. Their look is modest, egalitarian, reflecting the new revolutionary ideas of equality and the rights of man. These ideas were reflected in literature. Burney's 4 and 5 volume novels, almost too vast to read in today's busy world, are condensed under Jane Austen's astute pen to become sharp, incisive gems. So who was Fanny Burney? The Burneys were socially a rung or two below the Austens. They represented the new up-and-coming class, the intelligentsia, self-made, self-educated people. Fanny's father, Charles Burney, made it his priority to cultivate the rich and famous, which in that age of patronage was the accepted way for a struggling musician to make his way in the world. Fanny's parents came to Lynn Regis, now known as King's Lynn, Norfolk, from London, when her father took up the position of organist at St. Margaret's Church. He supplemented his meagre income by giving music lessons to the daughters of the prosperous merchants of Lynn, who were anxious to acquire the refinements of polite society. Fanny's mother, Esther Sleep, was an intelligent, accomplished young woman, a musician in her own right. Her parents were well matched. Both were set on a course of intellectual improvement. Fanny, their 4th but 3rd surviving child, was born in Lynn on the 13th of June, 1752. Susanna, 3 years younger, grew up to become her closest sibling and confidant. Esther educated her children at home. Hetty, the eldest child, received intense musical tuition, and by the age of 11 was reading with her mother all of Pope's work and the Aeneid in translation. Fanny, however, was a great disappointment. By the age of 8, she still couldn't make out the letters of the alphabet and was swiftly overtaken in ability by her younger sister. Her father noted dryly, Fanny was wholly unnoticed in the nursery for any talents. To overcome her handicap, young Fanny developed formidable powers of recall, reciting poems she'd heard while pretending to read them. No one at that stage realized that her eyesight was poor. And even before she could write, she was scribbling little works of fiction, legible only to herself. This self-taught inventiveness continued into her novels, making her a foremost contributor to the English language. There are about 114 words invented by Fanny Burney in the Oxford English Dictionary, including lunch, maisonette, and MP. When she did eventually learn to read, it happened, according to her father, all at once. After 9 years in Lynn, Mr. Burney brought his family back to London, but without James, the eldest son, who joined the Navy as a cabin boy, an accepted route for poorer sons to train as officers. The Burneys moved to Poland Street, Soho, which in those days was a respectable artisan area. After the backwater of Lynn, London throbbed with excitement, and 8-year-old Fanny, with her extraordinary gift of recall, would remember the thrill of seeing the city through new eyes, which she would vividly recapture in her first novel, Evelina, 18 years later. Life was never dull. The house was often the venue for impromptu concerts or private theatrical events. And because of her father's close association with the actor-manager David Garrick and Richard Sheridan, visits to the theatre or the splendid opera house in Haymarket were frequent, and the children often accompanied their parents. Charles Burney believed that much of his success as a music teacher in London was due to the remarkable talent of his eldest daughter, Hetty. Accompanied by her violinist cousin, Charles Rousseau Burney, they took London by storm, until they were superseded some years later by the next pair of child prodigies, Maria Anna and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. So the children grew up to regard the world of entertainment as a normal part of everyday life, and the influence of this heightened, colorful world can be plainly seen in Evelina. The violent scene in which the grotesque grandmother is verbally abused and thrown into a ditch, or the scene in which Mr. Lovell is attacked by a monkey, were scenes drawn directly from the world young Fanny saw around her, from the farce in the theatre, or from the knockabout clowning in the fairground, all playing out in the London streets. But Fanny's mother developed a cough that hinted of consumption. She revived a little at Hotwells near Bristol, and on her return to London, gave birth to her 9th child, Charlotte. But during that year, her condition deteriorated. Only Hetty was home when their mother died on the 29th of September. She was just 37. Fanny was inconsolable. As a result, Burney's novels would be inhabited by orphaned young women making their way in a bewildering world without the guidance of a mother figure, or for that matter, the proper guidance of a father figure. For although Mr. Burney adored his children, after the death of his wife, he became so absorbed in his projects that he neglected their needs, and the children were often left to fend for themselves. David Garrick, the actor-manager, and his wife Eva, who had no children of their own, virtually adopted the Burney children after their mother's death and gave them the use of their private box in Drury Lane. However, Mr. Burney realized that a good education was essential for daughters without prospects, so he decided to take his 2 eldest daughters to Paris to learn French. At the last minute, however, 9-year-old Susanna took Fanny's place. Fanny was the only child in the family who was not placed in a school and had neither governess nor instructor. To fill the lonely hours at home, Fanny devoured the range of books in her father's extensive library, and in the process learned about aspects of life that are usually shielded from young ladies, giving her writing a worldliness beyond her age or sex. In 1767, Mrs. Allen, with her sizable fortune, became Mr. Burney's second wife. Her 3 children, Maria, Stephen, and Elizabeth, joined the Burney household. Fanny and her sisters never fully accepted their new mamma, but they enjoyed the company of their rebellious stepsister, Maria, whom Fanny declared the life of our house and family. One of her mother's dying wishes was that her children should write little letters to her in the other world. But on her 15th birthday, Fanny burnt all her scribblings, perhaps to keep her writings to her dead mother from the prying eyes of her new stepmother. But the urge to write proved too strong. 9 months later, Fanny began her journal, addressed to her alter ego, whom she called Nobody. Since to nobody I can be wholly unreserved, to nobody I can reveal every thought, every wish of my heart, with the most unlimited confidence. In 1769, Mr. Burney received his doctorate in music and began an ambitious project, his General History of Music, which would be the first scholarly attempt in English to cover the development of music from ancient times to the present. Meanwhile, the bohemian nature of the Burney household meant that Fanny and her sisters were leading a less sheltered upbringing than most young ladies of their day. Fanny recorded the dramas that ensued when young blades called to woo Hetty and Maria. Sometimes young Fanny would accompany her sisters to assemblies and dances. Often they were unchaperoned. There is a long account in her journal of a masquerade they attended, which Burney transposed into her novel Cecilia, in which the unworldly heroine is confronted by some dangerous masked characters. It makes surprising, erotic reading. In 1770, leaving his new wife in charge of a rebellious family, Dr. Burney set out on a 6-month tour across Europe to begin the research for his mammoth musical project. Mrs. Burney sold the house in Poland Street and bought a more prestigious house in Queen Square, Bloomsbury, to accommodate their growing family. But while her father was abroad, Hetty, on a rebound from a thwarted love affair, eloped with her cousin Charles Rousseau Burney. Then Fanny's stepsister Maria eloped in France with the very man who had jilted her 6 months earlier. Mrs. Burney, heavy with child, was heartbroken. To compound her distress, that same year, her 17-year-old son, Stephen, eloped to Gretna Green with his young sweetheart. On his return, Dr. Burney set about writing the first volume of his General History of Music. Fanny acted as his secretary and copyist. Dr. Burney was now regarded as a musicologist of some repute, and David Garrick introduced him to Dr. Johnson's literary circle. About this time, Fanny began to correspond with an old friend of her father's, Mr. Samuel Crisp, and was soon addressing him as Daddy Crisp. She was flattered by the interest he showed in her, interest she longed to receive from her preoccupied father. Daddy Crisp became her mentor, and she was welcomed at his country retreat, Chessington Hall in Surrey, where in her own room she could write all day undisturbed. In her first novel, Daddy Crisp is transformed into Evelina's anxious old guardian, the Reverend Mr. Villiers, who becomes the recipient of her breathless confessional letters. By now, the Burney family had moved to St. Martin's Street off Leicester Square. The house had once belonged to Sir Isaac Newton, who had built a laboratory on the roof, an observatory, on the roof, and sometimes Fanny would creep up to the observatory to write in peace. She was now aged 22, and the eldest sibling left at home. St. Martin's Street became a meeting place for notables who were invited to Dr. Burney's celebrated Sunday evening concerts. And that's a contemporary cartoon showing Dr. Burney there talking to someone in the front. Meanwhile, in the Hampshire countryside on the 16th of December, 1775, shortly after the first volume of Charles Burney's General History of Music was published to great acclaim, a second daughter was born to the Reverend George Austen, rector of Steventon, and Cassandra, his wife. Jane was their seventh child. Social class, money, a good marriage, and rules of propriety regulated the Austens' world. Her family were gentry, albeit not wealthy, and most of the principal characters in her novels are from that class, living in rural England, creatures of their surroundings. If money were tight and a son obliged to earn a living, only a career in the navy or army or church was acceptable. Any venture that hinted of trade, however successful, immediately placed one on a lower rung of the social ladder. Before long, Dr. Burney was introduced to the Thrales of Streatham Park. He would visit Streatham to give their daughter Queenie music lessons and stay to dine. Mr. Henry Thrale, MP, a bon vivant, whom had made his immense fortune in the family brewing industry, enjoyed entertaining clever, ambitious combatants on a lavish scale. Hester Thrale, witty and intelligent, was the perfect hostess, while Dr. Samuel Johnson had lived as a permanent guest at Streatham for the past 10 years. Sir Joshua Reynolds, another Streathamite, was commissioned to paint portraits of the coterie, and Dr. Burney, the distinguished musicologist, was chosen as the 14th and last Streathamite to line the library walls. While Fanny's days were occupied as her father's copyist, at night she was secretly writing her first novel, Evelina. Her father was so engrossed in his own work that he took little notice of what was happening under his roof, and much was happening under his roof. News reached Mrs. Burney that her 16-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, who was finishing in Paris, had eloped with an Irish adventurer. Her daughters were both heiresses of their late father, and as it turned out, easy prey for bounty hunters. Fanny would remember this when she came to write her second novel, Cecilia. And there were whispers of yet another scandal in the Burney family. Fanny's brother Charles was apparently sent down from King's College, Cambridge, for stealing library books. An outraged Dr. Burney banished him from the house. Fanny came across her depressed brother and stopped him from taking his own life. And it is thought that Macartney, a character in Evelina, is based on Fanny's brother Charles. All 4 of her novels contain harrowing scenes of suicide or attempted suicide. Evelina is the story of a naive young lady's entrance into the world. Unfamiliar with London etiquette, Evelina makes some excruciating social blunders that place her in risque situations, while her artless beauty makes her irresistible game for all the rakes that come her way. Through Evelina's eyes, we encounter a comical world that is also cruel and rather frightening. And because of an innocent faux pas, Lord Orville's first impression is that Evelina is a poor, weak girl. Needless to say, after a number of misadventures, the couple are eventually united. Jane Austen used this idea of a bad first impression in Pride and Prejudice, when Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy first meet one another. And incidentally, the title of Burney's novel, Pride and Prejudice, Austen's novel, Pride and Prejudice, comes from a phrase repeated 3 times in the last chapter of Burney's second novel, Cecilia. Written in secret, the publication of Evelina was just as covert. Only her closest siblings knew of its creation. Fanny copied out the manuscript in a hand very different from her own, and brother Charles was charged to negotiate with publishers. She sold the copyright for 20 guineas. Although Evelina is epistolary, letter form, following the 18th century convention, nothing like the novel had ever appeared before, and London buzzed over the identity and sex of the anonymous author. Mrs. Thrale declared that it must be writ by someone who knows the top and bottom, the highest and lowest of mankind. Burney and her sisters giggled as they eavesdropped over the speculation. But now that it was published, Burney worried that her father would discover that she was the author and disapprove. In one scene, Evelina gets lost in the Marlborough Gardens and seeks the protection of some ladies of the night. With risque scenes like this, Fanny knew that she could no longer be seen as innocent Miss Burney, but as a subversive satirist who must have kept some very low company. Evelina would inspire a new school of English fiction in which women in society were portrayed in realistic contemporary circumstances, and Burney would become the most successful writer in Jane Austen's lifetime. Dr. Johnson praised the book. Sir Joshua Reynolds had to be fed while reading it. And when Dr. Burney found out that it was his own shy Fanny who was the author, he was too proud to keep it a secret. Mrs. Thrale insisted that she must meet Miss Burney. "I have now to write an account of the most consequential day I have spent since my birth, namely my Streatham visit," wrote Fanny in August 1778. When Fanny got over the shock of his appearance, she became Dr. Johnson's special pet. The elderly man and the young woman spent hours tete-a-tete at Streatham. Dr. Johnson adored her mixture of diffidence and self-determination, but he was never fooled by the meek facade she presented to the world. "Your shyness and slyness and pretending not to know nothing never took me in," he observed. Mrs. Thrale could not wait to introduce Fanny to the intellectual circle of women she described as the female wits, and called by those who ridicule them the Blue Stocking Club. Several years before, Mrs. Montagu, the renowned Shakespearean scholar, had paraded the young playwright Hannah More as her protégée. Now Mrs. Thrale would parade Fanny Burney as a celebrated author of Evelina as her young protégée. Unlike Hannah More, who loved to take center stage, Fanny suffered physical pain when she inadvertently became the center of attention. She preferred to be the little mouse sitting quietly in the corner, observing and memorizing everything around her. Dr. Johnson teased her about the prospect of meeting Mrs. Montagu. "You are a rising wit. She is at the top. When I was beginning in the world and was nothing and nobody, the joy of my life was to fire at all established wits. So to her, Burney, at her and down with her." Of course, he knew perfectly well Fanny would do no such thing, but she remembered his words when she came to embark on her next project. After the runaway success of Evelina, family and influential friends urged her to write a comic play. Hannah More, Mrs. Thrale told her, got near £400 for her foolish play. Fanny set about writing her play, The Witlings. A small audience of friends and family attended a private reading. Dr. Burney and Daddy Crisp were horrified. The play was undeniably a satire on the literary ladies of the Blue Stocking Club. Alarmed at the offense the play might cause, they urged her to abandon it and return to novel writing. Fanny was mortified. She had wasted a year writing The Witlings, and though she believed her daddies mistaken, felt powerless to go against their wishes. From now on, she would never enjoy the luxury of writing secretly and at her own pace. She was in demand as a celebrity, and Mrs. Thrale's patronage brought pressures. She wanted her with her at all times and showered her with gifts, which Fanny was reluctant to accept, suspecting that gifts carried with them obligations. This infuriated Hester Thrale. It is thought that the character Mrs. Deville in Burney's second novel, Cecilia, is based on Mrs. Thrale. Mrs. Deville is an attractive, intelligent woman, but when she is undermined, she becomes a tyrant and an emotional blackmailer, bursting a blood vessel in a rage. Such a character had never appeared in literature before, and readers were shocked. I meant, explained Fanny, to blend upon paper, as I have frequently seen blended in life, noble and rare qualities with striking and incurable defects. In August, Mrs. Thrale suffered a miscarriage. By October, she had recovered enough to insist that Fanny accompany her on a tour of the West Country. So many obstacles seemed to stand in the way of her writing, but Burney was formulating ideas. In a letter to Susanna, she described an heiress she encountered in Tunbridge Wells. She ran away with Mr. Wilson, a man nearly old enough to be her father, and of the most notorious bad character, both as a sharper and a libertine, and the foolish girl seemed scarce 16. I would not wish a more striking warning to be given to other such adventurous damsels than to place before them this miserable runaway. Living with the unhappy consequences of both her sisters' elopements, Fanny's next novel would be a cautionary tale for all young heiresses. 4 months later, Mr. Thrale suffered a stroke after eating a gargantuan meal. In April 1780, he was recuperating in Bath with his family, Fanny and Dr. Johnson. They hired the end house of South Parade. We have meadows, hills, Prior Park, the soft-flowing Avon, whatever nature has to offer, always in our view, Fanny wrote enthusiastically. Her stay in Bath became a dizzy round of socializing. In 3 weeks, she met the blue-stocking Mrs. Montague, who lodged at the circus, on 6 evenings at various houses. On the 8th of June, they drove to Bath Easton. Lady Miller's poetical assemblies had become a magnet for the ton of Bath society. They were seen as an alternative, indeed a refuge from the vulgarities of the Bath season. Fanny was warmly received as a celebrated author of Evelina. "Oh, what a book," cried Lady Miller. "Give me leave, Miss Burney, to tell you how much I am delighted with it. So much wit, so much sport, such humour, such life. I never laughed so much since I was born." The following day, however, such frivolities were over. Stagecoaches were rolling into Bath with "No Popery" chalked on the doors, and bringing alarming news that riots had erupted in London. What had started as a peaceful protest against the government's proposed extension of the Catholic Relief Act had escalated into a terrifying witch hunt against anyone with papist connections. The riots caused some 500 deaths and the destruction of more than 100 private homes. The riots quickly spread to Bath. Rumours reached the Thrales that their London house and brewery was being threatened by an angry mob, and alarmingly, Mr. Thrale was implicated, wrongly, in the Bath papers as a papist. That evening, the Roman Catholic Church and some adjacent houses were set on fire. The next day, the Thrale party fled to Brighton, where they stayed until the troubles died down. In the autumn of 1780, Captain Cook's third expedition of discovery returned, bringing her brother James home again. But celebrations were subdued when they learned that Captain Cook had been killed on the newly discovered island of Hawaii in an affray with the natives. One of Lieutenant Burney's fellow officers on the Discovery, Molesworth Phillips, was greeted as a hero, credited with shooting the native who killed Captain Cook. James brought Molesworth Phillips home and introduced him to the family. It was an event that would seal Susanna's fate. Throughout 1781, the dashing officer pursued and courted Fanny's beloved sister, Susanna. No one at that stage was aware of his cruel, possessive streak, which one day would cost Susanna her life. That winter, Fanny shut herself up to write. By the end of February, she was half dead from the eternal fagging of her mind and brains, and had only completed the first volume. In April, Mr. Thrale dropped dead after eating another gargantuan meal. There can be no doubt that in Burney's second novel, Cecilia's guardian, Mr. Harrel, is based on Mr. Thrale. The bon vivant Mr. Harrel lives a life of excess, spending borrowed money in a reckless frenzy until he has no alternative but to kill himself to escape bankruptcy and imprisonment. And he does so in the most public and dramatic fashion. Widowed Mrs. Thrale invited Fanny to spend the summer at Streatham, promising her the tranquility of the countryside in return for her conversation after dinner. The writing of Cecilia became a huge burden. Torn between the demands of her father, Daddy Crisp, and Mrs. Thrale, Fanny played out her frustrations in the novel. Cecilia is an heiress, but for all her appearances of self-determination, she is in fact powerless. Because she is underage, she is placed in the care of 3 guardians. But Mr. Harrel, Cecilia soon discovers, is a fashion-mad spendthrift who tricks her out of her inheritance. Mr. Briggs is a miserable miser, and Mr. Deville is too superior to bother with her. These patriarchal figures exploit, despoil, or mistreat women in all social positions. It makes painful reading. There was some personal input in the character of Mr. Belfield. Belfield is the spoilt son with 4 devoted sisters. All available means go to furthering his career, mirroring the situation in Burney's family. Brother Charles was sent to Charterhouse, then Oxford. He toys with the church, the army, and the law. His desperate mother and sisters are close to penury as they indulge his fancies. Later, Cecilia discovers him working as a gardening labourer. Rousseau's romantic ideals of withdrawing from society to lead a simpler life were becoming the fashionable ideal. Belfield says, "I behold that man be independent, who treats the great as the little, and the little as the great, who neither exults in riches nor blushes in poverty, who owes no man a groat, and who spends not a shilling he has not earned. I have now adopted, though poor, the very plain life I should have elected if rich." The theme of independence threads through both Cecilia and her last book, The Wanderer. It was also Fanny's personal philosophy. Published in 1782, Cecilia was well received and sold out immediately. According to Catherine Parison, Cecilia was generally regarded on publication as the most important novel since Tobias Smollett's Humphrey Clinker. Written from a female perspective, Cecilia is a deft blend of the satire of Henry Fielding and with the sentimentality of Samuel Richardson. Fanny was told that Mrs. Delaney and the old Duchess of Portland are reading it for the 3rd time and are anxious to meet the writer. Mrs. Delaney, a friend of the royal family, recommended Cecilia to the Queen. It was vetted by a bishop who allowed the princesses to read it, thus becoming the first novel to penetrate so far into the royal household. In celebration, Daddy Crisp commissioned portraits of himself and Fanny, painted by her cousin, Edward Francesco Burney, to hang in Chessington Hall. 6 months later, Mrs. Thrale married Gabriel Piozzi, the Catholic music master of her children. Society was scandalized, regarding him as quite unsuitable for the well-born wealthy widow. Fanny's disapproval of the match severed their friendship. Esther Thrale's betrayal, as Dr. Johnson saw it, hastened his own departure. 5 months later, he was dead. His death, following Daddy Crisp's the year before, left Fanny without her mentors. Her brothers and sisters were all married. She was left at home with only her young half-sister, Sarah. When Fanny heard that old Mrs. Delaney had lost her companion, she went to Windsor to comfort her. And it was during her stay with Mrs. Delaney in her Grace and Favour apartment close to Windsor Castle that Fanny was introduced to the King and Queen, who were in the habit of calling unexpectedly. 6 months later, Fanny was persuaded by her father to accept a position in the royal household. Fanny was appointed second keeper of the robes to Queen Charlotte, but in reality, she was nothing more than a glorified servant. She was summoned by a bell to dress the Queen at various times throughout the day and expected to stand in attendance. She was bidden to see no one at all but by appointment, to see no fresh person whatsoever without the express permission of the Queen, to receive no men, none. She likened her situation to an arranged marriage. Burney's perceptive accounts of life at court and as witness to the madness of King George have become important historical documents, but the staid atmosphere and rigid rules oppressed her beyond measure. She transmogrified from a shining celebrity to a voiceless servant, standing in attention for hours at a time, with no consideration taken for her personal needs or well-being. She later wrote, "I was worn with want of rest and fatigued with laborious watchfulness and attendance. My time was devoted to official duties, and all that in life that was dearest to me, my friends, my chosen society, lived in my mind only." While Fanny was imprisoned at court, her brain going numb with inactivity, Hester Thrale, now Mrs. Piozzi, was bursting with creativity and publishing to great success. Anecdotes of the late Samuel Johnson were swiftly followed by letters to and from the late Samuel Johnson. Fanny disapproved of the decision to publish, noting, "She has given every word, and thinks that perhaps a justice to Dr. Johnson, which in fact is the greatest injury to his memory." Jane Austen read Piozzi's works, for in June 1799 she wrote to Cassandra, "So much from Mrs. Piozzi. I have some thoughts of writing the whole of my letter in her style." In another letter to Cassandra, Jane slightly misquotes from anecdotes of the late Samuel Johnson. But all this, as my dear Mrs. Piozzi says, is flight and fancy and nonsense. At court, Burney tried to keep up her creativity alive by writing blank verse tragedies in her spare time, but they all came to nothing. Sir Joshua Reynolds was so shocked by her wasted appearance that he persuaded those in influential places to release her from her royal duties. After 5 soul-destroying years in royal servitude, Fanny was finally released in July 1791. The Queen gave her an annual pension of £100. A friend took her on a Western tour to recuperate. 6 weeks later, she was home. She was almost 40 years old, and by the standards of the day, middle-aged. Only her half-sister remained at home. But Fanny was content, living with her father. We read together, write together, chat. His society and kindness are more precious to me than ever. Susanna, now married and living in Mickleham, was sending her letters with news of a party of French aristocratic refugees who had moved into a large house nearby. In January 1793, Fanny stayed with the Locks of Norbury Park and met gentle, warm-hearted Monsieur d'Ablay, the French royalist officer. They fell instantly in love. Dr. Burney was against her marrying a penniless French émigré, but for the first time in her life, Fanny stood up to her father. Their courtship was a clandestine romantic affair. The Locks' gardener acted as courier, carrying their letters surreptitiously between London and Mickleham. 6 months later, 40-year-old Fanny married her impoverished émigré. It was a decision she never regretted, but it came as a shock to all those who knew her. They were blissfully happy, although money remained a problem, especially when Fanny discovered herself pregnant. Alexander was born in December 1794. He was the joy of their lives. To raise money, her friends helped her publish her next novel, Camilla, by subscription. 1,058 people subscribed, some for multiple copies, raising over a record £1,000. In fact, it was much more than that, because each person paid a guinea, so 1,058 is a lot more than that. The names included Hannah More, Mrs. Montague, Burke, Hastings, Mrs. Piozzi, fellow novelists Anne Radcliffe and Maria Edgeworth, as well as an impressive list of dukes, duchesses, and titled people. One subscriber was Miss Jane Austen of Steventon Rectory. Burney sold the copyright for a further record £1,000 and dedicated the novel to Queen Charlotte, her illustrious patron. Camilla achieved its objective, making enough money to build themselves a home. The Locks leased them a plot of land, and Monsieur D'Ablay designed a house on the proceeds. In 1797, the family moved into Camilla Cottage to lead the simple life that Belfield had advocated in Cecilia. Money remained a worry. Monsieur D'Ablay returned to France in 1801 to seek a commission in Napoleon's army, but he stipulated that he should not be required to bear arms against his wife's country. Napoleon found this request unacceptable and advised D'Ablay not to leave France without incurring suspicion of disloyalty. In April 1802, during a period of peace between the two countries, Fanny joined her husband in Paris, but the peace was short-lived. Within months, they were trapped. She and her son were exiled in France for 10 years. Much of The Wanderer was written in exile. Critics were disappointed that Burney wrote little about her experiences in France, but focused her criticism instead on English society. But it was too dangerous to write anything overt about the revolution in France. Had she been discovered writing anything seditious, she would have been thrown into jail. One theme in The Wanderer is the conflict between silent, suffering Juliet and Eleanor, the feminist with revolutionary ideals. These characters mirror the duality of Burney's own personality. Eleanor, her alter ego, the Mary Wollstonecraft character, expresses all the radical ideas that Burney dared not. Predictably, the Eleanor character is doomed, just as Mary Wollstonecraft and all the outspoken radicals in that dangerous political climate were also doomed. The Wanderer was written through periods of great anxiety. Burney was diagnosed with breast cancer and underwent a complete mastectomy in September 1811. She wrote one of the most harrowing accounts of undergoing an operation without anesthetics that has ever been written, and has become a modern-day icon for breast cancer sufferers everywhere. Miraculously, she survived to live another 30 years. While Fanny was recovering from her traumatic operation in France, Jane Austen's first novel, Sense and Sensibility, was published by a lady in the October. The novel started life under the title of Eleanor and Marianne, as a novel in letters in 1795, following the style of Burney's first novel, Evelina. But Austen later abandoned the epistolary style and rewrote Sense and Sensibility in the style we all know. It was published on commission, and Austen's banker brother Henry agreed to cover the costs. After the death of her father in 1805, Jane, her sister and mother, had to rely on the generosity of her brothers for support, and perhaps she now felt an urgent need to contribute to the household. Sense and Sensibility made a profit of £140, which translated in today's money is £13,400. Jane was delighted. During a lull in hostilities, Fanny and her son were given permission to leave, but while at sea, hostilities between France and England re-erupted. The ship was intercepted by the British, and Fanny and Alex returned to England as prisoners in August 1812. Meanwhile, the copyright for Pride and Prejudice was sold to Egerton for £110, and Pride and Prejudice was published by the author of Sense and Sensibility in January 1813. Her father had first offered the novel, under its earlier title, First Impressions, to a publisher 15 years earlier, but it was declined by return of post. In his letter, the Reverend Austen wrote, "First Impressions is a manuscript novel about the same length of Miss Burney's Evelina." The novel was well received, with 3 favorable reviews for following publication, and it would become Jane Austen's most popular novel and loved by millions today. 2 years later, Burney's The Wanderer or Female Difficulties was published. In the opening scene, a group of English civilians flee at night in a small boat from the horrors of the French Revolution. They pick up a nameless, silent woman. They cannot make out what country, class, or race she belongs, and her anonymity arouses intense speculation. The Wanderer is Burney's most personal novel. It was a metaphor for her own story. She was the voiceless nobody who became the subject of intense speculation when London buzzed over the identity of the author of Evelina. For most of this long novel, the identity of this female remains a secret. Through her many guises, from black mulatto, penniless seamstress, to music teacher, Burney highlights the difficulties encountered by working women with a sensitivity not found until the social novels of a later era. Moving from the bustling streets of Soho to the ordered confines of Windsor Castle, Fanny had a unique opportunity to observe society from the lowest to the highest and understood the difficulties of actors, singers, and musicians. She wanted her readers to understand how selfish attitudes could result in dire consequences for the vulnerable in society. One reviewer was hostile. The Edinburgh Review condemned her for going outside her sphere to judge the world, arguing that women writers were an inferior species and deficient in imagination and reason. Ironically, of course, Fanny was writing within her sphere. Everything in The Wanderer was built out of her experiences, but the review sounded the death knell for the novel. Fashions were changing. Shutters were coming down on women's lives. Jane Austen's Fanny Price in Mansfield Park, published 2 months after The Wanderer, heralded a new kind of heroine, timid, silent, passive. Burney's women, striving for independence, would be stifled in the coming climate of evangelical morality. Did Jane Austen read Burney's massive 5-volume The Wanderer? Living in Chawton Cottage in the Hampshire countryside, Jane was at the height of her creative powers. Mansfield Park sold out within 6 months, and she was halfway through her next novel, Emma. In September 1814, she wrote to her niece Anna Austen, "I have made up my mind tonight to like no novels really, but Miss Edgeworth's, yours, and my own." In 1814, Napoleon was defeated and exiled to Elba. The monarchy was restored in France, and D'Ablé was offered a place in the Garde du Corps. The delighted D'Ablés left Alexander at Cambridge and returned to France. But no sooner had they arrived than Napoleon escaped from Elba and was marching towards Paris. Burney fled to Belgium, while her husband fought in the army opposing Napoleon. She was in Brussels during the Battle of Waterloo and helped to bandage the wounded. D'Ablé was raised to the rank of Lieutenant General, with the title of Count conferred on him by Louis XVIII. In December 1815, Emma was published, and Jane Austen sent a complimentary copy to Maria Edgeworth. In Emma, Jane Austen plays with literary conventions, as she does in all her novels, creating, as her nephew James Austen Leigh revealed in his memoir of Jane Austen, a heroine whom no one but myself will much like. Austen clarified this in a letter to her niece. In our ideas of novels and heroines, pictures of perfection, as you know, make me sick and wicked. The Dublays returned to England in October 1815, shaken and ill. Through an unexpected technicality, they lost their home, Camilla Cottage, and retired to Bath, which was seen as a respectable city for the new impoverished gentility. They settled in lodgings in Great Stanhope Street and were blissfully happy, taking quiet walks along the river or calling on their many exiled royalist friends. In the spring of 1816, Austen's brother Henry retrieved the manuscript of Susan, which would become Northanger Abbey, which had languished at the publishers for 13 years, paying £10, the sum for which it was originally sold. Jane changed the protagonist's name to Catherine and set about revising it. A second edition of Mansfield Park was published, and Jane Austen completed Persuasion in the August and began working on Sanditon. But by January 1817, it was clear her health was failing. She and Cassandra moved to Winchester to be closer to skilled medical care. On the 18th of July, 1817, Jane Austen died, aged 41. She is buried in Winchester Cathedral. Her brother Henry and sister Cassandra organized the publishing of her posthumous works, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, in 4 volumes. In the biographical notice that accompanies the volumes, Henry Austen writes, "She sent into the world these novels, which by many have been placed on the same shelf as the works of a Doublet and an Edgeworth." And Sir Walter Scott would describe her gift as that exquisite touch which renders ordinary commonplace things and characters interesting. Today, Jane Austen is a superstar among literary figures. Her novels are known across the globe, while those of Fanny Burney and Maria Edgeworth languish as footnotes in her story. Fanny Burney, or as she was later known, Madame Doublet, outlived her by 22 years. She died on the 6th of January, 1840, and is buried in St. Swithin's Church, Bath, close to her husband and son, the very church in which Jane Austen's parents had married 53 years earlier, and where Jane's father, the Reverend George Austen, was laid to rest in 1805. These days, Fanny Burney is better known as the author of letters and journals, an important chronicler of 18th century society. But during Jane Austen's lifetime, Fanny Burney was regarded as the foremost English novelist. Virginia Woolf hailed her as the mother of English fiction. Burney was a pioneer of natural dialogue, especially skillful in portraying multiple voices to personify character. Her novels challenged the masculine perspective that had hitherto dominated literature, depicting more realistic feminist protagonists than those of Austen's earlier revered writer, Samuel Richardson. And the comedy of manners genre, which Fanny Burney perfected, inspired Jane Austen to develop her own genre of domestic realism. As Virginia Woolf said, Jane Austen should have laid a wreath on the grave of Fanny Burney. Thank you.
Well, that was really wonderful, I thought. Gosh, so much information. Are you convinced? Was Fanny Burney Jane Austen's favorite writer? What do you think? Anybody have any questions?
There's one at the back there. Oh, it's
One at the back, okay.
Yeah, that was fascinating. But what fascinates me is really Fanny Burney was so prolific and, you know, represented the social situation, you know, through her novels so much. But what happened? I mean, why did people lose interest in her novels?
Why is she not so popular now?
Yeah.
Well, they're massive. I mean, they are huge things. You know, her last one was 5 volumes. 5 volumes. You know, they are massive stories. You have to really sort of give yourself all. I think that's the main reason, really. You know, what was so wonderful about Jane Austen is she could be so incisive. You know, she, you know, later on, after Jane Austen, Charles Dickens and all that, they started to expand the novels again. But her novels were so precise, and it's wonderful the way she wrote.
Yes.
But she, you know, Fanny Burney did, because she had so much experience of theatre. You can understand why she was so good at doing different voices in her characters.
Yes.
And she was a very social writer as well. Yes. People don't realize that, but she really was. I don't think Jane Austen was a social writer like Fanny Burney. She used to really show her readers how society was not being very fair to certain people in society. She was really good like that, which you know, you could really feel the pain of some of these women and how they were badly treated, and other people as well, you know.
I was fascinated by the fact that you mentioned that she added 40 words to the Oxford English Dictionary.
Yes.
Including lunch.
Yes.
My question is, what was lunch known as before that then?
Luncheon.
Oh.
An MP, I don't know, I suppose it was Member of Parliament, I suppose.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I just was curious, is anything known about what happened to her son? Did he inherit any
Unfortunately, you mean Fanny Burney's son?
Yes.
Unfortunately, he was a very difficult child. I think he was sort of slightly Asperger's. He was very difficult. He did get to university, and he did train as a priest. And he was just settling down. And just before he got married, at the age of 40, he died. It's so sad, really. 2 years before she did. So sad, so terribly sad.
Is it possible today to get her diaries?
Yes. Yes. You can get it. You can get it sort of shortened edition. You know, letters and journals. Yes, I've got a copy. You can.
Oh, fantastic!
Oh, yes, easy. In fact, I think I've got on the next page.
People are quite interested in her diaries because of her knowledge of George III and his madness. That's one aspect.
Yes, at one stage, George III, the king, you know, who was mad, was chasing her around the courtyard. He was literally chasing her around the courtyard. She was very great friends with the king and queen. You know, they were treating her as friends, you know. So, yes, it's quite amazing, really, when you think. Yes. Yeah, it's there somewhere. Letters and journal. Look, the top one on the right.
Yeah, well, thank you for your lecture. I was going to ask almost the same questions to Parley, that both Fanny Burney and Maria Edgeworth were important authors in that time and are largely forgotten today, whereas Jane Austen seemed to go from strength to strength. And, I remember
I think what happened was that when Fanny Burney's diaries and letters were published, people were more interested in her as a chronicler of her times, because they are incredibly interesting, you know. She really did write very quickly and flowing writing in her diaries. It's very interesting, and lots of conversations. She was very clever at remembering a conversation she had with Dr. Johnson, and she'd write down the whole conversation. It's a wonderful way of actually, I think she's the most, I think she was able to actually you really felt what it's like to be an 18th century person in those times. And she really had these wonderful conversations that are all recorded in her journals.
And what about Maria Edgeworth? I mean,
Well,
she's
yes,
largely forgotten.
she was at the end of Jane Austen's life. Maria Edgeworth was becoming very well known. She probably overtook. You see, Fanny Burney didn't really write much after that last. Well, she didn't write anything after that. She just wrote a biography of her father. But Maria Edgeworth was she was getting well known. But her books have a sort of moral aspect, which I don't think people really like. There's stories, but they've also got a kind of moral, which I think puts
I
people
think
off
that's
a bit.
why they're out of fashion, don't you think? Right, anybody else? Well, I'm sorry about the technical difficulties, but it didn't distract as far as I'm concerned. Everything seemed fine, and you just fed us so much information. It was a wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.